Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
This is Daren Dochterman, and we are the Inglorious Treksperts.
See, I thought it was a classic femme fatale. Just so much fun.
Like that Shakespearean lace in your acting.
I said, Gene, what do you want from this character?
I want you to just take the character and make it your own.
I had a good time on the film.
On day one, the movie was already $15 million over budget.
We started this movie without an ending. That's like painting yourself into a corner.
I don't think we've ever had a Star Trek captain on our show.
Being, as you said, number one on the call sheet, it is a producer's position if you're going to take it seriously. I was so glad they didn't cast me as Lorca.
You famously wrote that script in 12 days.
On one level, I wrote the script, and on another level, the story was written by everybody and his brother.
New episodes every Saturday, wherever you listen to podcasts, or download the Electric Now app. Keep on trekking. Ingloriously, of course. Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
And this is Daren Dochterman, and we are the Inglorious
Treksperts. And you are watching Comic-Con at Home and a special episode of Inglorious Treksperts where we're going to be talking about the 30th anniversary of the Best of Both Worlds, arguably the greatest episode of Star Trek The Next Generation ever.
And because it's Comic-Con at Home, I have my dealer's room set up right over here. So come on by and buy lots of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds like fun. I think I'll do that.
Sounds like fun.
And joining us for our own little Comic-Con is Ashley Miller, the writer of such films as Thor and X-Men First Class. He's been a writer-producer on shows like Lore and Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, and is working on a new Netflix series as we speak. And welcome back, Ashley Edward Miller.
You know, thank you for having me. I will say there is one big difference, aside from the obvious, between this and an actual Comic-Con panel.
You're sober.
Yes, exactly right.
Oh, my.
Oh, man. I can't tell you. I mean, I don't want to. Obviously, we're here to talk about Best of Both Worlds. And Comic-Con 100% did the right thing canceling this year's show. But I miss it. I miss it. You know, I was looking forward to it, and
I miss hanging out in the hotel bars.
Yeah, me too.
Because it's not about drinking. Sometimes it is, but mostly it's about hanging with friends who actually know what you're talking about when you talk about stuff like this.
I have fond memories of the of remember back at the Marriott where we all came back from the masquerade, I think it was, and Arena was on in the hotel bar.
That's right.
They're watching classic Trek, just having the greatest time. And of course, that's when we met the inimitable Dan Poole, who was regaling us with stories of how his dream in life was to meet Stan Lee because he had just made a fan Spider-Man film. And of course, he wanted to show it to us. So we went to get, this is how long it was, we went to get a VCR from his room. And Stan Lee walks by. Oh my God, it's Stan Lee. You believe this? And Stanley goes, Excelsior.
Excelsior, yes.
And then Dan Poole comes back, and we're all like laughing. He can't understand why. We said, because Stan Lee just walked by. He said, no, you guys are kidding me. You're pranking. And we're like, no, he really did. Couldn't believe it. So he was stunned. He was upset. It was whatever. We watched this film. He said, I got to go to the bathroom. He goes to the restroom. Sure enough, who comes out of the walks by? Stan Lee. And it was like, oh my God, how can this be happening to Stan Lee? He goes, Excelsior. And we're just like, this is the craziest thing. And we had just so many amazing memories of.
Yeah, and they're all as wacky as that.
Yeah.
Really. Like year after year.
Yeah. I mean, everything from yacht parties to masquerade fun to all just dinners. I mean, that's where the infamous phrase, last night we partied, tonight we're going to rage comes from, because we went to this dinner of about close to 25, 30 people squeezed into a restaurant. And some guy came along and with a bunch of us who were really close friends, and he decides he's going to give a toast And he stands at the top. Nobody knew who he was. He stands at the head of the table and he holds up a glass and he goes, "Last night we partied. Tonight we're going to rage." And it's like, who the hell are you? But
the butters of the.
We over the years, we've just met so many good friends, and made so many enemies. No, made so many good friends, and just it's really a remarkable time business, more than just a convention. It is it's Woodstock for geeks. It's been called, and I think that's true without the mud, because God, we geeks, we don't like the mud. I'd rather go to but it's really a shame, but I'm sure Comic-Con will come back bigger and better next year, and right. Everyone's going to be so anxious to return, and it'll be really, really special.
And hotel prices will be $800 a night.
Can't wait for the social distancing on the convention floor.
Right.
Going from booth to booth, right?
Going from 3 inches to a whopping 8.5 inches.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, and it's too bad because, of course, now our kids are, Ashley and I are old enough that they want to go to Comic-Con and they want to buy stuff, and it's like the dreamer has awoken, and
yeah, it's that time.
Now it's like, I remember, because after when WonderCon was canceled, my son was like, he had his whole list of stuff he wanted to buy. I said, "Don't worry, we'll get it at Comic-Con." So I said, "Don't worry, we'll get it next year."
You're a liar.
Yeah. So anyway, we're here to talk about the 30th anniversary of the Best of Both Worlds, and we got a really great guest coming up. Elizabeth Dennehy is going to be joining us, who played the wonderful Commander Shelby, and I didn't realize she was 28 years old, and it was one of her first roles when she did. And you'll hear that she talks a little bit about the fact that she was a little green, but I think it's just a marvelous performance that she gives.
She was awesome in it, and I loved the dynamic that she came in to stir up the pot, because it was the end of the 3rd year, right? And so we were a little bit jaded with how everything was happening on the Enterprise, and I think that this new fresh blood coming in to maybe conflict a little bit with our happy family was a good thing.
Isn't it interesting, by the way, that Shelby made that kind of an impression on us? She never came back, but think about some of our favorite guest stars, our favorite guest officers on
Ronnie Cox.
That's right. Jellicoe, Ensign Rowe,
yep.
Shelby. They're all kind of cut from the same cloth. Frankly, I would have watched Captain Jellicoe, Commander Shelby,
Abso-freaking-lutely.
show.
Yeah.
Oh my God! But they all kind of brought that thing that it's on Deep Space Nine, right? It's like they just would have been a part of the fabric of it. But on the Next Generation, right? They're freaks, but in a great way. And I can't believe she never came back. And I would love to see her be like freaking Admiral Shelby on Picard.
How great would it have been if she had been the admiral who told Picard to shut up?
That's right.
How awesome would that have been? But alas.
It's funny because, of course, this is a character that finds its way into a bunch of novels and comic books because everyone loves Shelby. And I think that, Ashley, you hit the nail on the head. All these characters have one thing in common. They brought conflict to the show. On a show that was a conflict diverse, whether it be Jellicoe, whether it be Shelby. And the problem is they always felt it had to be a guest star. There could never be conflict between the actual characters on the show. And I contrast that with something even as mediocre as the Tholian Web, where Kirk is gone and Spock and McCoy are at each other's throats, and Kirk sort of referees from the grave. And it's great.
Yeah.
And Next Generation just really always felt, and I loved it, we all do love Next Generation, but felt that the show, the 24th century, we had evolved beyond interpersonal conflict. And I don't think that's ever going to be.
And it felt like the drama was shackled somehow by that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But Roddenberry always insisted that that's how it was supposed to be. But you point out the Tholian Web, which I think was just prima facie evidence that was never really the case. That I think that the idea of what Star Trek was evolved in Gene's head as opposed to what it actually was. But again, when you got the best of both worlds, that sense of there's blood in its veins, man, was just amazing.
Roddenberry's box didn't really exist until Next Generation.
Mm-hmm.
Reinventing the myth of Roddenberry, because there was never that on the original show. There was plenty of conflict. And I think also his Roddenberry's box, quote unquote, was taken to extremes. Especially, this is sort of a seminal season for Next Gen, because of course it began with Michael Wagner, who had just finished Isaac Asimov's short-lived Probe series for ABC, being hired to run the show after Maurice Hurley left after sort of the disastrous season 2. He had had enough. It was, and that's a whole nother episode. And Wagner has basically a nervous breakdown, can't handle it, can't do it. And they bring in one of his proteges, a guy who he had worked with on Probe and had formerly been a network censor, Standards and Practices, Michael Piller. And Michael, to his credit, immediately realized what the show needed. It needed to focus on character. And yes, you could argue that he took Roddenberry's box too seriously, but he also knew instinctively that this was a show that needed to have a character. And even though it fumbled around early in the 3rd season with stuff like Evolution, where Ken Jenkins and Wesley are dealing with a new life form, by the time you get to stuff like Ensigns of Command and Who Watches the Watchers and Data's Day, I mean, the show is kind of firing on all cylinders. But I think the show, and Brandon talked about this when we had him on too, he was just an intern who had abandoned, who didn't like Star Trek and then got talked into watching Best of Both Worlds. And that was the show, I think, that brought people home. It was the people who had no interest or who would watch the show early on the first season and said, this show sucks, that came back and realized, wow, this show has something to say. This show is worthy Star Trek. And certainly Best of Both Worlds Part 1 delivers on almost every level. And I mean, a great villain. And we've talked about this before. Introduced, let's not forget, the Borg were introduced in Q Who, arguably an even better episode, the 2nd season. They were a cyberpunk-inspired villain, but very unique to the Star Trek universe. There's never been anything like it. Certainly not the Klingons and
not since Captain EO.
Not since Captain EO, but the Klingons and the Romulans were very much mired in sort of Cold War archetypes. Right. And the Borg were a kind of 80s, they're very 80s. Cyberpunk was huge then, William Gibson. And so it was something we'd never seen before in Star Trek.
And I think there's something to be said that it was sort of it had more relation to Aliens, the movie, than anything else we'd seen. Something that couldn't be reasoned with, that was sort of not really animalistic, but definitely the hive mind is something that couldn't be reasoned with.
And it was a force of nature. I just literally just now had a thought about that episode I've never had before. And it has to do with this conversation we're having about Shelby, right? And Shelby as this force of opposition, right? A source of antagonism. So in that episode, the Borg never really take on a face other than when they become Locutus. Even then, Locutus still feels like he is a part of that body, right? Like he is a part of the storm. But the reason why we have conflict, the reason why I think that we don't think about the facelessness of the Borg is that Shelby comes along. Shelby is an alien invader too. And because she's in that story, it doesn't matter that the Borg don't have a face. And maybe, sort of thinking about how the Borg evolved through Star Trek and how it's like, we need a queen, which still worked. We need a queen. It's like, or however the hell it got used in Voyager as Voyager went on, that what it was really missing was, or the reason why the Best of Both Worlds really worked and everything else just didn't quite, was because there wasn't an organic conflict that was happening among the crew, other than just the conflict that they're having with the Borg. It's like, and maybe that's the thing that was missing, that Shelby was just as threatening to the crew as the Borg was in its own way.
Oh, totally.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think you can go even deeper, because I think, what it does so well is it weaves the A and the B story in a sense that the story is about Riker confronting his future. And is he going to abandon Picard? Is he going to abandon the Enterprise to take this command? And then ultimately in the sci-fi story, he has to decide, is he going to abandon, Picard and take command and do what's necessary, even though it's going to lead to the death of his mentor? So character and the sci-fi story merge so perfectly. And, with Next Generation, that was a big problem, particularly in the 4th and 5th season, where the A and B stories didn't connect at all, and one might work and one was a total disaster, and then this, it just seamless.
But again, the great part about Best of Both Worlds, certainly part 1, is that without Shelby's influence, the Enterprise was probably going to be destroyed or taken over, because of the way that the rut that our crew had been getting into, that they weren't ready for it. Yeah. So that's another twist on it. Yeah, she was right.
And she needed to kick them out of their complacency.
Yeah.
They were very complacent. And I want to ask you guys personally, do you recall what your reaction was when you first saw this episode back, 30 years ago?
Absolutely.
Well. Yeah. I was sitting, I remember watching it for the first time, back then, a big television was maybe 30 inches, big CRT. And I'm sitting in front of it, like cross-legged, like I'm a little kid watching Saturday morning cartoons.
Well, you were a little kid.
I'm obviously a grown-ass man, but I'm sitting there like this, and as Mr. Worf fired, and I just kind of went like right into the screen. I just was blown away by that. I remember what time it was. It was amazing.
Well, I had videotaped the entire first season of Next Generation. Basically every week was a new hope that, it was going to be more like what we wanted. And it never really got there until about the 3rd season. But I remember when I watched it, I thought, oh my God, this is great. Particularly because of the character of Commander Shelby. And that she was there to kick these boring people in the ass, basically. Because honestly, I thought that Next Generation was pretty boring. And,
I had really obviously come to like it in the 3rd season, which is not to say there weren't worthwhile episodes in the 1st and 2nd season. Remember,
not at all.
Some time on the sets at this point, and was really trying to like the show, and force myself. But then, episodes like Who Watches the Watcher and The Survivors, that season really raised its game. And I was excited about the show, and obviously excited about the finale. This is the time of 26 episodes. But, it sort of sputtered around towards the end of the 3rd season. There were a couple of clunkers, I couldn't tell you specifically, but I know that, that was the season, I think, of The High Ground, and there was a couple of clunkers. And then I think Tin Men was that season, if I'm not mistaken. So a couple of episodes, not all that exciting.
Tin Man.
And then, from the moment this starts, all of a sudden, Shelby comes on, and she's a whirling dervish, and she's powerful, and let's face it, she's sexy. We're all in our 20s. She was, she was great, and she was a powerful, strong person who knew what she wanted, and it's like, wow, this is a military ship, and it's like seeing her families, but this is how it should be, right? And she's trained and she's competent, and it's really exciting. And by the time you get to Mr. Worf fire, and then to be continued, and that wonderful musical sting, I don't think you can underestimate what Ron Jones did for this.
Mm-hmm.
So rare that the music actually was helpful to Next Generation. I think the music made it more boring most of the time.
Right.
And Ron Jones just took it, and he took this to 11, and then that dun 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 dun. And I'll tell you where I really missed it. I recently rewatched it, but I watched that recut version that they did for Blu-ray, where they turned it into a movie.
Right.
So it seamlessly goes, but it doesn't have the dun 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 dun. And I much prefer that on the actual episode going to the cliffhanger than the sort of seamlessly cut version of it.
So you prefer the dun dun dun.
I prefer the dun dun dun.
But isn't it amazing though that you'd think, as a fanboy that you take those 2 episodes together, you just watch them like a movie and it's the same experience. But here's the cost. The cost of doing that is that moment that grabs you by the balls and squeezes, of Mr. Worf fire. It suddenly doesn't have the same power.
Right.
It's suddenly just kind of a moment, and it's not shot or edited and conveyed in such a way in the condensed cut, so that the outcome, the surprising outcome, lands in the same way. It just doesn't.
which is why I always wait 3 years after watching Empire Strikes Back before I watch Return of the Jedi again.
Same here.
The real way to watch Best of Both Worlds is to watch Best of Both Worlds Part 1, watch the clip, and then stop, and just never Part 2, and just whatever you imagined in your mind. And it was kind of like Empire that summer, if you remember, where it's like, oh, is he really Luke's father? And who is the other? And where's Boba Fett? Going to do with Han Solo and all this stuff. And it was like that with Star Trek too. Everybody's like, is Shelby going to stay on the Enterprise? Is Riker going to leave? Are they ever going to deborgify Picard? I mean, these are the questions people were asking, and it was great. And it was great because it got people talking about Star Trek. Right. It was time, I really feel like, since Star Trek 2, where like people were like really talking about it. Like the was covering it, and there were a lot of articles in TV Guide and magazines. Remember those? And they were talking about like this amazing cliffhanger, and people.
It was actively in the zeitgeist.
Even the jocks were talking about freaking Star Trek, man. I mean, that was the weird part.
Don't listen to the jocks.
I know, but just like that, I had football players like who were like living in like this suite next to me, and those guys were talking about the end of Next Generation.
Dun, 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 dun. No. Anyway, really extraordinary. I got to say. It's funny. It feels like those 10 years between the end of Star Trek and the motion picture were almost infinity. So when you say it's 30 years between Best of Both Worlds and today, that's crazy.
It's crazy.
It's nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad because we have a great guest and people are really going to enjoy. We're bringing Elizabeth Dennehy to join us, who's going to talk about what it was like to play Commander Shelby and really great insights into the role and her perspective, which is very different than ours as fans. So let's
bring her aboard and see if she can stir up things as she did on the Enterprise.
Sounds good. Beam her aboard. And joining us is Elizabeth Dennehy, the star of Best of Both Worlds, who portrayed the very memorable Commander Shelby. And I first of all, I got to ask you, can you believe here we are 30 years later? I mean, this is crazy. No. Feels like yesterday.
I can't believe it. When I was 28 when I did the 2 episodes, and Jonathan Frakes said to me, "You have no idea what's going to happen to you because of this, do you?" And I said, "What are you talking about? No." And so, no, I cannot believe it. I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it. It's surreal.
And what's remarkable is television is filled with cliffhangers, and but other than Who Shot JR, I can't think of certainly no cliffhanger comes to mind that has become as much part of the zeitgeist and become like sort of a pop culture classic as the resolution of the cliffhanger for Best of Both Worlds. I mean, do you find
that's what everybody tells me, but at the time, I don't think any of us were aware of how momentous it was. I mean, certainly we knew that it was the first cliffhanger that Star Trek had ever done. It was the first time anybody questioned Riker's command. So we were breaking ground, but we couldn't have predicted that people would still be talking about it 30 years.
Right. Yeah. Sure. It's really interesting because obviously I went back and rewatched it in anticipation of doing this episode. And obviously it still holds up remarkably well, particularly that first hour. And you're great in it. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit. Was it sort of the traditional shows up on breakdowns, your agent calls you, says going for this thing called Star Trek Next Generation, and you read with a bunch of people?
The very first convention I went to was in St. Louis, Missouri, and I was with George Takei, and I was absolutely terrified. I was so scared because I was afraid that the fans would hate me because I never watched the original series. I didn't know Riker from Picard. I knew nothing. I was an actress going on yet another audition, and I actually had disdain at the time for the whole sci-fi fantasy genre. It just wasn't my thing. I was more of a Brideshead Revisited, more into, I was a total Anglophile. So I was the kid who watched the Six Wives of Henry VIII and Brideshead Revisited and Upstairs, Downstairs. That was my jam. I was a Shakespeare nerd. And the kids in school who were into sci-fi were, I'm sorry, very strange. And one did not really want to be associated with those kids.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Elizabeth. It's a shame you have to go.
I remember when I was in high school, I went to an all-girl Catholic school, and the boys, people who were into like Pink Floyd were scary kids who were into drugs. And so I was like, I hate Pink Floyd. And then as I got older, I went, oh my God, they're an amazing band. Do you know what I mean? Like the group, the group that something appeals to, the group that circles around a certain culture can actually be off-putting.
Right.
And so I'm sorry, I know. So I was terrified at this convention that they were going to just hate me.
That there was going to be time for a little payback.
Yeah, that I was
like freaks, only different.
I didn't, know what a phaser frequency or any of that stuff was before. I just got asked, and it was just another job. But remember, I was 28. I was really young and immature and stupid and foolish. And then when I did the job, and it was so much fun, and then I went to the conventions, and people were so kind and so sweet and so welcoming. And so I was schooled. I was definitely schooled.
The ensemble of Next Generation, unlike a lot of shows, is a group of people that actually got along. They're in the third season. You don't see that in a lot of shows, as you know. And I imagine they were very welcoming. And, at the time you didn't know it because you hadn't done a lot, but I'm sure being a guest on a lot of other shows subsequently, you realize how unique that experience was.
It was unique. The other thing that's very interesting on any show, every show I've ever been on, there's a big difference between the last episode of a season and then the first episode of the next season. They are tired. And every show I've ever been on, it's been that way. The mood, the environment, where the show is in the hills and the valleys. Like, for instance, I did the last episode of Brooklyn Bridge, and they already knew that they were canceled. So that was a very kind of disheartened, despondent kind of cast. On the other hand, when I did Seinfeld, it was right after they first broke the top 20.
Right.
It had been on for years and years and years, and nobody knew about it. And the episode I was on was when people first started getting aware of the show. And so that was a huge energy, lots of enthusiasm and excitement. And so on Best of Both Worlds, the last episode of a season, they're tired. They're really, really tired. They've done 26 episodes. 8 days a week, the full-on makeup, and they were very welcoming and very sweet. But then when I went on and did part 2, which was the first episode of the next season, they're rested, they've had a little bit of a break. It's a completely different energy.
Right.
Totally. What, in retrospect, when you look at that episode, I mean, I know that Michael Pillar got, it's so sad how, that he passed away, but he said one of the most asked questions he always got is, why didn't you bring Shelby back? Or when did you bring Shelby back, when he was being asked these things contemporaneously? Did you ever think that, that was a character that you would portray again on that show? Or was it, okay, this was a guest spot, it was fun, and now I'm moving on? Or did you think, like the fans, when am I coming back?
Well, the fans asked that a lot. At the time, I didn't know what they were doing. I did feel like the second part kind of wrapped up my story pretty abruptly. And so there's been lots of theories being kicked around that I was brought in to show people that they should re-sign for the next season. I have no evidence to say that was true. I think it was I think it was a brilliant story. It was brilliant storytelling, but nobody ever said anything to me. And quite frankly, I look at it and I think I'm not great. I see all the times when I was nervous, all the times when, oh my God, that line took forever for me to get right. I mean, I think that's very normal that you see all the flaws. Oh, I hate my voice on that. Oh, I can see that I'm looping. I can tell that line is looped, added in later. So I only ever see the flaws, and I think that's very typical. So it's very nice that people liked what I did and are impressed by it. But it's just an acting job for an actor.
Yeah.
You go on to the next.
And of course, you're thrust into a situation, particularly as a young actor, where there's this entirely new language. It's almost like doing Shakespeare for somebody who's never done Shakespeare. Technobabble and all this stuff, you have no idea what they're talking about. And for somebody who didn't know the show and didn't really know science fiction or care for science fiction, must have been crazy for you.
It was brain breaking. There's a line that I will never forget that I spent probably 5 hours. It's not about learning the lines. It's about saying them as if you talk this way. Right. And you really, really know what you're talking about to get that comfortable. And it's funny that you mentioned Shakespeare, because I'm now a Shakespeare teacher at a high school. Loxa is an arts high school, and I teach Shakespeare. And that line that broke my brain, I actually use in my class. Nice. Because like Shakespeare, to say, if you can say, separate the saucer section, assign a skeleton crew to create a diversion, like you know what you're talking about and you talk this way all the time, it's exactly the same. And so I use that as an exercise for saying a lot of S sounds, right, and separating the words so that people can understand what you're saying. And
that's
they love
awesome.
that.
And the act of, like all actors do, is taking something that is meaningless and giving the inner life and meaning for you. So that,
well, actually, I pictured separate the saucer section. I totally see what that means. Assign a skeleton crew to create a diversion. Right. It makes total sense. You have to play the movie in your mind and actually really see what you're talking about. Right. And I think that the reason why Gene Roddenberry and the whole Star Trek world stands out is that actually makes sense. It's not gobbledygook. It's not nonsense. I did another sci-fi fantasy show that rhymes with the word charmed. And I asked a question. I asked a question once. I was what do they call us? An elder. And I wore long white robes and we know everything. And I remember one scene where I said to the director, if I know everything, why am I asking the human all these questions?
Right.
And they said, don't ask questions like that. And I was like, wow, this is not Star Trek.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You got to ask questions like that.
The inconsistency of that kind of drove me crazy. And you would never have had that in Star Trek.
Right.
If you're all knowing, then you're all knowing, right?
Yeah.
You're right. You're either or you're not. There's not
exactly
there.
Why am I asking her so many questions? And it was just, exposition.
Right.
You're just mostly knowing. You're not all knowing, just mostly.
Like,
you're a lot knowing.
I'm standing on the top of the Golden Gate Bridge and I'm asking the human all these questions. It was very bizarre. So I think the consistency of the mission of the passion of, Gene Roddenberry's mission and how that carried through all the iterations of the show was very palpable.
Right. Yeah.
Very clear.
And I think that also there's something else I found interesting in watching the show recently. It's 30 years later, and obviously what we find acceptable has changed. I mean, there's all this controversy. Oh, is Gone with the Wind? Should people still watch Gone with the Wind? Because obviously we look at it in a different perspective now. My argument would be, of course you should. You should also be aware of the history and the context in which it was made. Now, watching Best of Both Worlds, there are a couple of cringy moments. There's that one scene where George Murdoch says, talking about Shelby, and he says, he's very impressive. Picard says, very impressive. He says, only an old man's fantasies. And this is supposed to be the enlightened 24th century, and it's such a pillar kind of like 90s line, and it sticks out like a sore thumb, and it really dates it. And even my wife, who's a huge Next Generation fan, watching it says, oh my God, Riker would never talk to a man the way he talks to Shelby. And right. if that's something, in watching it, or just even at the time, it's like, you get brought in to be, not only a force, of nature that upsets the apple cart, but you're also, the sex symbol there.
It's very interesting because when I first started doing conventions, so you wouldn't believe how many people will actually raise their hand. I'm talking 30 years ago and say, I hated you. I hated you. How dare you? And you were such a bitch. And I was so taken aback by this because in my mind, I was just trying to get the job done. Yeah. Riker was in my way. He was being Hamlet. He was being really waffly and indecisive. And I saw exactly how to solve the problem and cut through all the bureaucracy and BS to get the job done. I'm the girl in the class who always has the hand up, the straight A student always raising her hand. Right. Well, should that child sit on the knowledge and the wisdom and the skill? No. Then as time went on, I started hearing that less and less. And I started hearing even from men and young men, I thought you were awesome. I thought you were great. And just goes to show you how much things have changed in 30 years. And then the last few conventions I've gone to, I never hear, I hated you. Mm-hmm. And I realize that people say that because if you think of somebody as all-knowing, omnipotent, Riker, and then somebody comes along and says, you're not all that. That's really hard to hear. Right. Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad that I was ignorant of the world, because I think if I had a concept of how important this was and how, drastic it was, I would have been too nervous. And I was like, what are you talking about? I don't care.
Yeah, it totally, because that's what would have come through your performance. Yeah. And the fact that you aren't like that at all, that you don't give a shit about them on this ship. You just want to get the job done and you want to do your best for it. And that's what's so great.
And as the actress, I was ignorant enough that I didn't defer to them.
Right.
And if I had any concept of the scope of what it was I was doing, it would have been harder to be immune to the deference. Right. And I don't know what is the big deal. Honestly, I went in the makeup trailer and Jonathan Frakes introduced himself. He said, I'm playing Riker. And I was like, oh, I thought the baldy guy was Riker. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea who was who.
That's Shatner.
It wasn't back in the day where you couldn't just pull up on YouTube and look at old shows. Right. Mm-hmm. This is what, 1990? There wasn't even, I didn't even have a computer. Right. So it's not like you could do research on shows before you got on them.
I loved you from go. Like, I thought that Shelby and Riker had probably the most realistic relationship of any two characters in like the Next Generation, just in terms of the actual dynamic. In retrospect, it very much reminded me of actual naval officers that I dealt with and kind of how they deal with each other. Just that back and forth was just awesome. I could have happily watched the Riker Shelby show for the next 3 or 4 years.
That's so sweet. That's so sweet. I got to tell you that my first day on the job, Jonathan had worked with my father. So he knew my dad, and he was like, my trailer is your trailer. Because of course I was in a tiny honey wagon and he was in a big trailer. And it's like, you need a phone, you need a place to sit, you need to eat or drink anything. Mi casa is su casa, just like open door. And so welcoming and so fun and delightful and really, really charming. And here's something else that I don't think a lot of people know. We didn't have the second part. Right. When we filmed the first part, we didn't get the second part until right before because they wanted everything top secret. And I don't even know if they knew what they were going to do.
No, they did not.
Jonathan said something to me, which I actually knew already from doing The Guiding Light, is you kind of have to play everything. And I hope you understand what I mean. When we couldn't be only adversaries, right. We had to play that there was attraction, or he was playing, I recognized myself in her. Right. And we had to leave the doors wide open for any possibility, because we didn't know what was going to happen in the second episode. Were we going to kill each other, or were we going to end up in bed? I mean, we really didn't know.
Or both.
And and from the Guiding Light days, I learned that you would have this terrible fight scene with somebody, and then the next week you're falling in love with them. You had to be a three-dimensional person and really, really live in the moment and be open for everything. Otherwise, you'd look like a maniac the next week when, you had to just sort of, I don't know, play every possible option as a possibility, I guess.
Yeah.
That makes
and
sense.
that's so great about Jonathan. I mean, he hasn't changed a bit in 30 years. I mean, he is just wonderful and welcoming and terrific and talented now as he was 30 years ago. I mean, and he hasn't changed. I wonder, how much feedback you were getting from Cliff Bole, because Cliff Bole, the director, was sort of like an old school TV director back in the day when they were traffic cops. Certainly not a very visually, visuals were not his forte. I wonder if, do you recall, and it was a long time ago,
He gave me one of the best acting notes I ever got. I remember the scene where I'm saying to Riker, all you know how to do is play it safe. I suppose that's why someone like you sits in the shadow of a great man, passing up one command after another. And Jonathan is much taller than me. I'm 5'6". He's got to be 6'4", 6'3", or 6'4". He's a very, very tall guy. And, remember, I was very young, 28. It was my first job arriving in Los Angeles. And I'm going to see if I can demonstrate this. When I was doing the scene with Jonathan, looking up at him, I suppose that's why someone like you sits in the shadow. Cliff said to me, when you get upset and your voice goes up, you kind of look like a little schoolgirl. He said, I need you to plant your feet firmly in the ground, stand your ground, look him straight in the eye, as much as you can. I suppose that's what, and then took my voice way down. You're in my way. And that was the best note I ever got in my life, because I was forgetting about how, having theater training, like on stage, that might have worked the way I was doing it, really feisty and in your face, but taking it down and being really cool, it brought the camera into me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Stood my ground, and it was the best note ever, and it changed everything for me, for Shelby. And talking about that, playing everything, playing whatever could happen. Somebody just asked me about when they keep changing the phaser frequencies and we lose the attachment. It works. And somebody asked me about that smirk on my face, like, do you know what I'm talking about? The moment I'm talking about?
Sadly, we do.
Okay, so that was an example of maybe I'm a Borg. Maybe I'm a Borg in disguise, to playing every possible adventure. Maybe it turns out I'm the villain.
Right.
So I wanted that smirk to be like, I'm a straight A student and I get an A in Borg, but also I rock. It could have been interpreted lots of different ways, and that was all intentional. Because if it turned out the next episode that I was a Matahari double agent spy, I wanted you to be able to trace that. Oh, that's what that look meant.
Right.
So you have to really be thinking all the time as an actor. You're playing like 5 different things at once all the time.
You mentioned before about your dad. I just want to say, on behalf of all of us, deep condolences on the loss of your dad over the past couple months, and we are all fans of his and of yours. But we just wanted to
thank you so much.
To say we were thinking about you.
He was awesome. He was a great guy, and he was 81, and when he hit 75, he really started to physically decline. So it was, the worst part was not being able to go. He and his wife live in Connecticut, and we wanted to, my sister and I, who live out in LA, wanted to get on a plane, but there was just no way. There was no way. So hopefully we'll be able to celebrate his life in grand style when this nightmare is over.
Hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the first time I ever saw him was in Foul Play as a kid. And I took notice of him then and was always a fan ever since. Obviously, so brilliant, and a much better movie subsequently. Not that I don't like foul play. It's funny listening to you talk about how you were playing the role. Boy, I sure liked your version of Best of Both Worlds Part 2 a lot better. Because of course, famously, Michael Piller tells the story of how, he thought he was leaving the show. So he wrote the show into a corner, knowing he wouldn't have to get them out of it. And then he re-ups his contract and has to come back and has no idea how to resolve this situation that he's put the characters in. And it was sort of a thankless no-win scenario in a sense. How you're facing an unstoppable foe and now you have to stop them. And that's a real challenge. And I think, as you allude to, your character gets a little lost in the second part. And I think, that's one of the most dynamic parts of the show is the Shelby character, which is so refreshing because, the conflict was anathema in the past to Star Trek. And this was a case where two characters, as you said, really get to go at loggerheads, and it's so refreshing and so interesting. And it's really interesting to hear what was going on in your head as to where this potentially would go.
Yeah. I was mostly concerned about not gaining any weight over the summer.
Barbecues. No.
Oh my God. I had to spend because we picked up right at the, fire. And then we had to pick right up there after a 3-month break.
Right.
Wearing a skin tight spandex jumpsuit. And I was in New York visiting family. And I ate nothing but fruit. That was all I was concerned about. Was matching. And they had a new hair person came in, and she was like, I would have done something differently, but we have to match. So yeah.
That's fascinating hearing the machinations of putting on a show. It's great. Thank you.
It's so funny because you always think that there are more I guess highly evolved than they are. And then I got on the set and I was really impressed by the BORG costumes and everything. They were actually with all those tubes and lights and couldn't pee. But the other side of it is when we get hit, we literally are like, is that a 3 or a 10? This is a 3, a 10, you go flying out of your chair. I thought, this is really how you do it?
Did a stunt coordinator have to teach you that scale? Like, here's like the 1, the 2, all the way to the 10?
Oh, mm-hmm. They had to teach us the scale. And oh yeah, I was surprised that they hadn't come up with anything more scientific. It's really funny when you're on a film set and like you've got digital now, and my son is a film student at NYU, and what you can do, the technology and animation and CGI, and yet at the end of the day, when that microphone is on, everybody has to be quiet. And if a plane goes overhead, you have to stop filming. It's amazing how far a lot of things have gone. But at the end of the day, you got to be quiet if there's a plane. It's funny to me. Or a siren goes by.
The basic rules still apply to everything. We're all doing a show out in the backyard.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to tell you a funny story about, do you guys know who Seth MacFarlane is?
Sure.
Of course.
So he did this show called Blunt Talk, starring Patrick Stewart.
Yeah.
So I am friends with Adrian Scarborough, who plays the little redheaded guy who was Patrick Stewart's really good friend. And they are really good friends in real life. So Adrian Scarborough came over and he said, hey, you want to go to the premiere? And I was like, awesome. So we go to the premiere, and it's at the WDGA, the theater on Sunset Boulevard, and
theater, yeah.
And Jonathan and Marina and Gates and everybody's there, and I sit in the row with all the Star Trek people who I had just seen days before at the convention.
Right.
And Seth MacFarlane gets up on stage and he's saying that he's a Star Trek geek. He is obsessed with Star Trek, knows every line to every show, and his dream was to work with Patrick Stewart. And so when he got the opportunity to do the show, so later on at the party at the Chateau Marmont, I grabbed my sons, one's an actor and one's a filmmaker, and I said, let's go test Seth MacFarlane. And I went up to him and I said, hi, so you're a big Star Trek Next Gen fan? He goes, yes. And I said, I'm Lieutenant Commander Shelby. And Seth MacFarlane looks at me and goes, Well, that means you're Elizabeth fucking Dennehy. I suppose that's why someone like you sits in the shadow of a great man, passing up one command after another. Battle bridge. He said every single one of
my goodness.
And my boys, my kids were like, who are you? They were like, are you really cool? It was so great. And that could have gone badly.
Right.
If you know, it could have gone very, very badly. I was really taking a risk, but it was awesome.
Yeah. If you had called him out on his fakery.
I don't remember you. That would have been so embarrassing. He knew every line. It was incredible.
That's hilarious.
My sons were so impressed.
Well, if they're not going to bring you back on Star Trek, they should bring you back on Orville. I think let's just have the fine.
Absolutely. I would love that. Totally. Yeah.
Well, this was a delight. And I know we all can't believe it. 30 years, one of the great TV cliffhangers of all time. And you are such an important and beloved part of it. So thanks for taking the time to sit with us and talk about it.
Of course, anytime. I'm sorry we couldn't get down to Anaheim. I like going to conventions.
I know.
Now I like going to them. My first one, I was scared to death.
Rain check, because I mean we were luring you down with dinner at Morton's and the whole Megillah, because and then it got canceled, and then we said, okay, well, we'll do Comic-Con then. We'll just push.
Well, we used to go to NAMM every year.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd get a hotel room, stay down there, make a weekend out of it. We love it. Yeah, I was very disappointed. And I even like going to Las Vegas. We drive the whole way. I make my boys drive. So yeah, no, I'm sad. I any excuse for a good meal and a couple of drinks.
Absolutely.
I know, and it's San Diego. It's obviously there's much worse things going on in general. Obviously, over 100,000 people have lost their lives, but it is sad that Comic-Con isn't happening. It's such a special thing for a lot of people, and it's just a sense of camaraderie, and particularly after the isolation of the last couple of months, it was something for people to look forward to. But I'm sure next year, everyone will party like it's 1999 again. So
I think there's going to be a spike in the next couple of weeks with all these protests. I think this was it's a trauma inside of a trauma.
Yeah.
We're going through very traumatic times right now.
Well, anyone who actually listens to science and listens to the scientists as they should, I think is expecting a second wave of, I think it's the people who think they're epidemiologists based on their Facebook posts that don't believe it. And I'll go with the scientists every time, but that's just me. So
let's look at Italy. People who've gone through it before.
Yeah.
For evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And South Korea just closed their schools again, so the whole thing is just, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And right now it's the worst of times, but this too shall pass, hopefully.
So I teach Shakespeare. We put together this evening of Shakespeare scenes, and the world got canceled right before we started our tech rehearsal. So the head of the theater department and the principal were like, we have to put something together. So thank God I was so clever to be quarantined with an NYU film student.
Right.
Because we zoomed all 33 of my kids, 14 scenes. He edited the whole thing together, and oh my God, I'll never complain about a tech rehearsal in a play. Never again. This was so hard, but it's been very strange. It's been very, very strange.
It's amazing that Zoom has become the glue that's keeping people together. It's a weird sense of.
The day before my father went into the hospital, it was his first Zoom. The whole family got together and had a Zoom. The reason I did it is because I was going to have him read King Lear with my kids, because I didn't know what else to do with them. Right. With the show being canceled, I thought, I know, I'll teach him how to pull the text up on half the screen. We'll read the play. And so with his wife, we were teaching him how to Zoom, and the whole family Zoomed. And then the next day he was in the hospital. And we're so glad. I wish I had recorded it. Right. He kept saying, who's editing this? Who's deciding which person is in the camera? Oh, get him to understand that the computer has a camera.
The computer is the new Daren, the new Kenneth Branagh. He's the new Orson Welles. It's the algorithm. Yeah. But anyway, well, look, thank you again, Elizabeth. This was great, and stay healthy and safe, and hopefully we'll talk to you again.
Okay, take care, you guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that was great.
That was
Elizabeth,
a lot of fun. Love her.
it's funny. I interviewed her years ago for Cinefantastic back in the day, but it was contemporaneous with the making of the episode.
Right.
This is much more interesting, having had 30 years to mull it over.
Well, I mean, after The Best of Both Worlds Part 2, I think everybody thought, I wonder if they're going to bring her back. And they never brought her back. Maybe after this episode, people are going to wonder, are they ever going to bring her back? Are they ever going to bring her back?
Yeah. Well, now that anyone can come back, apparently, I mean, so some weird people they brought back over the course of the series. And it does seem like there's not a lot of desire to create new Star Trek, but just mine stuff that worked before. Right. So I wouldn't.
That worked. Why not mine it?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I do remember talking to Michael, Pillar, who wrote the episode. And, I've talked about this before, the idea that he wrote it knowing he was leaving and not worrying about how to resolve it. And of course, when he re-upped his contract, he then had to figure it out. And that was really challenging. But one of the questions that he hated getting all the time, it would really annoy him, is when people would say, "You ever going to bring back Shelby?" And I never saw Michael never really got angry, but that for whatever reason always pissed him off. I think because Shelby was there to put pressure on the Michael surrogate, Riker. He saw himself as Riker, and that's all she was there for.
Right.
I think he saw her as any kind of special character or anything. It was just a story, a plot contrivance. But I think he was surprised and maybe a little disappointed that people liked that character so much, because they really they hated that question whenever you asked. And it wasn't just me. I mean, it's like, you ever gonna bring Shelby? And it seems such a natural thing to want to bring Shelby back, but she was so great in the role too. But yeah. I mean, at the time, I wonder if they were intimidated by like a strong woman, but then they created Ensign Ro and she was great.
Yeah, and then Deep Space Nine, all over the place. I don't know, man. Like I know I don't dislike Best of Both Worlds Part 2 as much as you do, Mark. But I think because honestly, I think where it really falls apart is the very, very end. Like the right idea was Picard was kind of the chink in the armor. But I think that for me, the fundamental problem was that it didn't leverage the conflict that had been established in that first episode. As much as I mean, there are things in that episode I love, right? I love Riker and his scene with Guinan, right? You throw that book away scene. I think that's great. I think all of the stuff where the episode is about that, it's awesome. But imagine a version of that scene with Guinan that's Shelby instead, right? Where that conflict, of you're just, afraid, you just pass up command after command, right? Turned into, okay, boss, I'm going to give you that pep talk that you need, right? And saying, now I believe in you, right? It's like, you're now the great man and you have to throw that away. You have to get out of the shadow. I think would have been transformative. It's that I think about that a lot, because I just feel like that scene is occupying a place in their arc. I desperately missed that character. It's not good.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I have to say that, I don't hate the second part. I thought it was a really challenge. It was a challenge to make that satisfying. I mean, I do feel it cheated its way out a little. The Kyushu, the Melbourne, he didn't have to make a decision because it was destroyed at Wolf 359, right?
Right.
Okay, but it would have been more interesting, I think, to see Riker have to make the tough call that do. And I would have loved to have seen, Shelby come back and see her advance in her career and him question his choices, like, that he wasn't as driven. But okay, that didn't happen.
It didn't happen. So forget it.
And the fact that really, I think if you look at Best of Both Worlds 1 really feels epic. It feels like a movie. 2 mostly takes place in Data's lab or Bay.
Right. Once they grab the card, it's like we're sitting in the lab.
Yeah. It doesn't feel big.
Nobody else knows what to do. Nobody else can do anything. That's the problem. It's a structural issue too.
I'm also, as you heard in the interview, not a huge fan of Cliff Bole as a director. I think there were a lot more interesting visual directors on that show. Look, TV at the time was very static in general. but David Carson, Rick Colby, David Livingston, these are all guys who knew how to move the camera and do interesting things and visually, and I don't feel that Cliff Ball to me was like the least interesting of all those directors. I thought Les Landau did a much better job. So anyway, but that's just me. But this is super fun, and happy birthday, Best of Both Worlds. I mean, you could argue this is the show that saved Star Trek.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
It definitely changed the perception so many people had. And for, a lot of the people watching this, they probably weren't even alive when this came on.
It changed the conditions of the test.
Right. Well, maybe yesterday's Enterprise saved the next generation, but the Best of Both Worlds turned Star Trek back into a phenomenon that now it's 30 years later. It's a colossal waste of time.
That's a really good point, because, of course, yesterday's Enterprise was third season. I think arguably it's the better episode. But it's Best of Both Worlds that's the one that turned Next Generation to a phenomenon. And that's because of the cliffhanger.
Yeah.
And because, at the end of 26 episodes, you have people coming back and wanting more of that fourth season.
Or the Cliff Bowl hanger.
Right.
That.
The bowl hanger.
I can't end this installment of Inglorious Treksperts without acknowledging that the Best of Both Worlds also paved the way for one of the great Next Generation episodes that was about to come, which was Family.
Yes.
Right.
Oh my God.
In Star Trek, where they actually dealt with the repercussions of Best of Both Worlds.
Right.
And small, intimate story that in many ways, sort of paved the way for Picard, for better or worse.
And it paved the way for Picard to completely ignore all those things.
And it paved the way for all good things on the plus side.
Of course. It did. Family is an extraordinary episode. Jeremy Kemp as his brother. And to see Picard sort of stripped bare figuratively, emotionally, by this rape, which is what it was.
Right.
It was really remarkable, and at the time, pretty extraordinary. And it was not. I know there was a lot of resistance to do that episode because it was, Star Trek on Earth. There was no trekking, and
but resistance is futile.
And it was so good. It was so good. And then, of course, Best of Both Worlds really paves the way for First Contact, and we'll have Brandon Braga us in a couple of weeks to talk about First Contact, and that's a great show to look forward to. And speaking of great shows, we hope you enjoyed this fantastic San Diego Comic-Con at Home panel featuring the Inglorious Treksperts. And if you enjoy the Inglorious Treksperts, you can listen to us every Saturday wherever you listen to podcasts at Inglorious Treksperts. And if you want to watch us, you can visit your favorite app store and download the new free Electric Now app. Download that, and you can watch Inglorious Treksperts every week, along with the 4:30 movie, Best Movies Never Made, and episodes of such shows as Leverage and The Librarians. It's 100% free, and it's available for both Mac and for PC. And you should check us out on the Electric Now app, or just listen to audio podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts.
Audio podcasts, yes.
Audio podcast. So anyway, on behalf of Ashley, Daren, and myself, I want to thank you for joining us for this very special Comic-Con at Home episode of Inglorious Treksperts. And we'll see you next year at Comic-Con, and hopefully next Saturday on Inglorious Treksperts, wherever you listen to podcasts. And I have just one thing to say. Mr. Worf, fire. Dun, dun, dun. No?
Dun, dun, dun.
Keep on trekking, ingloriously, of course. Engage.